Hey guys, I'm Patrick Hall with Fstoppers.com, and today I want to do something a little different and edit a few landscape photos with a program that acts as an alternative to Lightroom. Today I'm going to be reviewing Alien Skin's brand new all-in-one editing suite, Exposure X4. If you're a wedding photographer, event photographer, or if you travel a lot and have massive amounts of images to edit and cull, you probably spend a lot of time in Lightroom, Adobe's raw processing software. Anytime we release a tutorial in our store or we film a free YouTube video, people always inevitably ask, what is a good piece of software other than Lightroom that I can use to edit my own photos? Up until now, I don't know that I've really had a good answer for this, but with the release of Alien Skin's brand new Exposure X4 software, you can really do all the culling and editing in a single piece of software other than Lightroom. Now, a full disclaimer here, I've personally been using Photoshop with the Alien Skin Exposure plugin for now over 10 years, and it's always been the final process for my own workflow. But this is going to be the first time that I've tried editing a few raw files in their newly released Exposure X4 standalone suite. Now, before I get into the edits, let's talk about some of the reasons that you might want to try something like Alien Skin Exposure instead of using Adobe Lightroom. First up is the price. Alien Skin is $149 for both the plugin, which works both in Lightroom and Photoshop, and you also get this standalone application that I'm going to be using today. Now, Adobe does offer Lightroom 6, which is their only perpetual licensed software, which was released in 2015. And it also is $149. But if you want a subscription to their Lightroom Classic, part of the Creative Cloud suite that Adobe updates pretty often, you will have to subscribe to the Creative Cloud, and that is $9.99 a month. If you go through the B&H link in the description below, you can actually get both Photoshop and Lightroom for $119 per year, which is a few cents less than $9.99 a month, which is definitely a better deal. If you don't mind actually owning the software outright and it doesn't bother you to be on a subscription model, Adobe's Creative Cloud is pretty nice, and we use all of the Adobe software here at Fstoppers, so that's something that we definitely subscribe to. But if you don't want to be locked into a subscription model, which many people don't, and you want something that you can use for years, Exposure X4 is definitely worth looking into. Next up is filters. Every photographer really is familiar with Lightroom as it's become the industry standard for culling and editing massive amounts of raw files. What excites me most about Exposure X4 though is not only do you get an editor that is very similar to Lightroom, as you'll see, but you also get hundreds of color and black and white film presets that really can quickly give your photos a unique look with just the click of a button. You can always edit, tweak, and change the overall strength of these filters too, which makes it much more powerful than just having a bunch of presets. With the previous Alien Skin plugins for Photoshop, once you've applied the preset, it was sort of burned into a single layer in Photoshop, but with the full X4 suite, you can now add a preset to its own layer, and then you can tweak all of the settings in a non-destructive way. For me, these presets are really what sold me on the Alien Skin plugin a decade ago, and it's awesome that you can now apply these to your images in a much less destructive manner. Perhaps the biggest feature that really makes Exposure stand out over something like Lightroom is their incorporation of layers and layer masks. If you're familiar with using layers in Photoshop, you're going to have an easy time figuring out layers in Exposure 4 because they do a really unique job of giving you all the functionality of a program like Lightroom while still letting you stack different effects on top of individual images. For me, Lightroom's adjustment brushes and gradient filters can really get pretty confusing and cumbersome when you start stacking everything on a single image. So this is a really nice feature, especially if you like being organized and having more control over each of your edits and masks individually. Alright, so now that I've explored a few of the reasons why this software might be perfect for you, let's open up a few raw files from my recent trip to Alaska. So what's really interesting about this software is it doesn't use the same cataloging system that Lightroom uses. It simply looks at the folder that you point it towards, and it doesn't even have an import like Lightroom, so it actually loads pictures a lot quicker. So if I go here to my C drive, let's go to desktop, and in here I have some landscape images already picked out, and you can see they just instantly load up really quickly. We didn't have to import them, which takes a long time in Lightroom. And you can see I just have a bunch of random pictures here. To be honest with you, these are kind of snapshots. I'm not really super proud of any of these photos, but I think these will be great images to use for some quick edits. As you can see here on the right, everything is pretty much identical to Lightroom. You have all of the basic adjustments that you're going to be used to seeing in Lightroom. You have other modules like detail, color, tonal curve, vignette, overlays. Overlays are going to be some of the features that we have in the presets, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then you have things like grain, infrared, which could be cool for landscapes, bokeh. I don't believe I've seen this in Lightroom. That might be a new module. Lens correction and metadata. And up here on top is where you have your different layers. So I'm going to add a couple different layers throughout this tutorial and show you how you can do some really creative edits and then control the overall intensity all in one spot, which is really, to me, the biggest benefit of this software over Lightroom. So let's open this image first. And this is a really amazing hike just outside of Alyeska. And this image, as you can see, is really dark. So what I want to do is I want to test exposure's shadow and highlight recovery. So for this image, let's just pull the shadows all the way up and let's pull the highlights all the way down. And I actually imported this image in Lightroom and I did the exact same adjustments. I pulled their highlights all the way down and their shadows all the way up, because one of the new features of this software is that it has much better shadow and highlight recovery than Adobe's Lightroom. So if I toggle between these two renders, in my opinion, it almost looks like Lightroom does a little bit better job retaining some of the highlights and keeping those under control, whereas exposure looks like it actually pulls out more detail in the shadows. So if you're a really meticulous photographer who exposes for the highlights, you might actually be able to pull out much more detail in exposure than you can from Lightroom. Obviously, this is a pretty extreme example of pulling the highlights all the way down and the shadows all the way to 100. I don't know that I typically would do that, but as you can see, this image is very, very dynamic. I mean, it's got a lot of dynamic range. You have a lot of highlights coming in from the sun on the right, and then because we're in a forest, there's just not a lot of detail there. In fact, I could probably pull up the exposure just a bit here, maybe bump the contrast up just a bit, and maybe even warm the scene a little bit. Again, all of these settings are very similar to what you could do in Lightroom, so there's really no learning curve here. Maybe bump the brilliance up, pull the saturation down just a touch. Let's add a little bit of clarity. And we can come down here to other things like vignette. We can pull the vignette up, which is actually, I believe, backwards from Lightroom. We can make the size a little bit smaller. We can change the roundness. If we were actually to get rid of the softness, you could actually see where the vignette is. So all of this is very, very similar to Lightroom. And as I make all of these adjustments, I have to say that this is very responsive software. I mean, I'm running this on an older computer. These are 46 megapixel images. And I have to say, this appears to be running as fast as Lightroom, if not slightly faster. So let's open up another image just to play around here a little bit more. Now, this is the only star photograph that I took in Alaska, and it was actually about 10 degrees in the summertime at night. And it was so cold that I just decided I wasn't going to play around with this anymore. So this is the only photograph that I have with some stars, but let's see what we can do with this. Now, most people might try to bump up the shadows to bring more detail out of a dark scene like this, but I'm actually going to bring the shadows down to add a little more contrast to the image. And then with the highlights, I'm actually going to bump those up a little bit. Instead of recovering the highlights, I'm actually going to expose the highlights a little brighter. So that's going to make my stars really pop. And then with my whites, I can probably do the same thing. If I pull that to the right, you can see that looks a little extreme, but we might be able to go somewhere there. And then the black point, let's just set that maybe right about there. And with white balance, I mean, you can kind of put this wherever you feel looks natural. I think that's probably a pretty natural temperature for the sky, but I like my skies to be a little blue, even when shooting astrophotography. So that's pretty cool there, and let me show you how you can add some different presets, because really that's one of the big advantages of using Alien Skin software. So as you can see, all these presets are labeled really well, and every one of these is modeled after real film stock, which is really cool. They really nailed the way that old film looks, and in many cases you can actually use films that are not even in production anymore. So you can give your images a look from 40 or 50 years ago, even though that stock is not being produced anymore. So we come down here to color filmed aged, and if I just hover over all of these, you can see there's some presets that add scratches, completely different tonal qualities. And I've said this before in some other videos. I really like this because it allows me to see some possibilities that I might not have envisioned on my own. I mean, it's very rare that I'm going to think about turning an astrophoto into something really red like this, but I could apply this and then come here to the overall intensity, and I could kind of turn it down and find a perfect blend point that works well for me. But let's try to find something that's a little bit more usable. I like to go to the print under color films, and these give you things like Fuji Pro. You can come down here and you do Kodak. Here's Kodak Gold. That was a really popular film stock back in the day. So let's go with this Ektar. Hope I'm saying that right. I never actually shot on this film. And now that it's been applied, I can pull this down just a little bit, and then you have a before and after button here, so you can kind of see what it's doing. Let's open up another image where we can start playing around with the layers a little bit more. So here's an interesting viewpoint of Denali. And while we were there, we had an incredible view. I mean, we had very few clouds in the sky, which is not great for photography, but I've been told only 10% of people who visit Denali even see the mountaintop. Not only did we see it every day for a week, but we actually got to fly a plane onto Denali and land on a glacier. You can see that video on our YouTube channel. Really, really cool experience. So let's bring the shadows up quite a bit. We can really start to see those trees now. Pull the highlights down just a touch. Maybe we warm up the trees and give them a nice fall color. The trees are already starting to change quite a bit up there. And we'll bump up the clarity just a bit. Maybe the vibrance. And just mess with the saturation there. Of course, I could come down here to detail and I could start adding a little bit of sharpening. You can see that really brings a lot of detail out on those trees. We'll zoom back out. And now what I think I want to do is I think I want to edit the tree line separately from the mountains. So in Lightroom, you could pull down different gradients and you could try to dodge and burn all of this with an adjustment brush. But what you can do in exposure that's really cool is we can add another layer and we can make all of our edits on that layer and then adjust those separately. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come up here to the brush setting and I'm going to choose new layer and I'm going to add a single gradient. And what it's done, you can see up here, it's added a second layer with a layer mask, and it's actually already applied this. So now if let's just make this really extreme, turn down the exposure, you can see what this gradient's doing. It's making the lower side of the image dark. I actually want to reverse that. So I'm going to spin this around, and I'm going to move this up. And with a gradient, it's going to make this a really nice transition. I might even want to pull this up a little bit more. Somewhere right around there. And of course, let's change our exposure because that's a little too extreme. And then we can come back here and just tweak this just a bit. This pulls back some of the mountains. And what's really neat is let's try changing the white balance. If we make this a little more blue, we can give this image a little bit more dynamics by making the top part of the image blue while keeping the trees in the foreground nice and warm. Now, if I did something like this, that would definitely look a little fake. It's kind of a cool effect, but I think I want it to be a little bit more subtle. So we can go somewhere here. Maybe I can pull this up a little bit. And now I can adjust the mountain separately. So maybe I want my whites up on the top part of the image to pop a little bit more. We can mess with the highlights, which are going to really make the tops of those mountains pop a little bit more. That looks pretty good to me there. And then let's go down. I think the sky just looks a little too aqua color. It just has a little too much greens in the blues. So if you want to change that, we could go down to color. And everyone's going to be familiar with this. This is the HSL. This is hue, saturation, and luminosity. So let's go to hue, and let's find our cyan colors. And see, it's a little too cyan if we go that way, but if we go this way, we can make it a little bit more blue. If we go to blues and tweak that, we can make that just a little bit more blue. And it might be a little too strong, so we can actually pull the saturation of the blue down just a touch. And with the luminance, we can actually pull up the color just a bit. I think that looks a little bit more natural. And in fact, I'm actually going to go up here to the top and pull down the saturation just a touch. maybe pull the vibrance up. We can even put a little more clarity into the mountains. And if you're familiar with Photoshop, you can simply click on the mask here. And I'm going to go, instead of eraser, I'm going to go to the B brush. And I'm just going to paint some of this yellow out just a touch. And I'm being pretty crude here. If I really wanted to take the time to finesse this, I probably could get this perfect. But, you know, something like that looks pretty good. And if we come up here to the before and after, you can see straight out of camera there wasn't much of a shot. With just a few simple edits, we really brought back a lot of detail in the foreground as well as the mountain. So let's open up one final image. And this photograph I've actually already edited. You can see I've kind of changed the crop. I've made it very narrow. And what's really cool is if I come up here to the history, I edited this image on another computer, and you can see I can go all the way back and get back to the very original edit on a different machine and see everything that I did in the history. So let me show you how you can use a dodge or burn layer to maybe add a little bit more detail in certain areas of the tree. So if I come up here to my brush panel, I can actually just use one of these presets, and I can come down here to, let's do dodge, which is going to lighten. And if I invert this mask, you can see what they did here. They added a new image on top of the image I already edited. And if I scroll down here, you can see they've bumped the exposure by 2 stops. Now, this might be a little extreme. Maybe I want to set it to like 1 stop. And let's go ahead and invert that mask, which is going to hide this image. And now with my brush, I can come down here, and let's set this flow a little bit lower, maybe to like 23%. I can just slowly brush in some more highlights on these trees. Maybe I want a few more highlights on these foreground bushes. And what's really cool about this is it's not just a simple dodge layer. I could come down here and pull the whites up just a little bit more and make the highlights pop just a bit. I could come here and maybe I want to make the trees just a little bit warmer. And that kind of makes it almost seem like some of this sunlight is hitting the trees where it wasn't before in the underexposed image. And if you feel like that's just a little extreme, you can always come up here and turn down the overall intensity. So I have to say, after using the software for just a few days, there are a few little things that I'm not completely familiar with. I do find that I hit the wrong brushes at times, or that I add a layer when I didn't really mean to add a layer. So I don't know if that's necessarily a knock on how the interface of this software works, or if it's just because I'm not that familiar with it. If you have never used Lightroom before, I'm sure you would make a ton of mistakes as well if you were messing with their adjustment brushes. But if you use the software a lot, I think this is pretty intuitive. You have all the same tags and rating systems, so if you like to cull a bunch of images, I can come down here and I can say this image is a 2, and then this image is a 3, and let's make this a flagship 5, another 5, and then I can come over here and sort all of the images by greater than 3. And it's just a really powerful platform that looks a lot like Lightroom, but instead of actually renting the software, you can buy it for $149. So at the end of the day, who is this software for? I believe this is for someone who's looking for an alternative to Lightroom. If you don't like the payment plan model, and perhaps you're not even editing photos every single month, you probably don't want to be paying $10 a month for a service that you're not using. If you like the older model where you actually own the software and you can install it on a bunch of computers and you have your own key that registers it with the company, that's exactly what Alien Skin has done here. If you're looking for a snappier, faster platform to edit photos, Alien Skin claims that this actually renders files faster than Lightroom, and if you're like me and you've used Lightroom for years, you know how slow Lightroom can actually be. If you want to give Alien Skin Exposure X4 a trial, head to the link below. You can download a free trial, play around with it for 30 days, and if you use the discount code below, you'll also save a little bit of money on your first purchase. If you enjoy content like this, head over to fstoppers.com where we feature content like this every single day. Make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel below, and if you want to learn from some of the best photographers in the world, head over to fstoppers.com/store where you can check out our full-length tutorials.